one killer disease in Africa. So when I think of all those, I would like to marry them with the challenges that we go through in Africa. Which challenges International Needs Uganda derives its mission and vision. Think of the number one challenge in Uganda today is HIV/AIDS. It's responsible for more than 2 million AIDS orphans. 2 million are the orphans because of AIDS in Uganda. And there are other things to cause orphans. There are civil wars, there are some other deaths. At my school, I have a small boy, he's about 15. His father and mother died of AIDS. And this boy goes out of class at 5 to look for food for his brothers. He's only 15 and he's taking on the responsibility of being a father. And when I think of those children, it is like that basket of Moses floating on the riverbank and anything could happen to it, like these children. Because of AIDS, we have so many grandparents who have so many grandchildren around them because all their children died and they are there to look after them. And I always tell people here that in Uganda, we don't have a social security where somebody goes to a bank and gets money like you do here. So this old, poor, widow grandmother, she has to look after these children without any extra income because of AIDS. Yesterday, I was sharing with a gentleman at breakfast about the challenge of water. That here you have water everywhere. When I first came here, I was in Melbourne and I was thirsty, and somebody told me there are those spots where you go and press water and water comes out and you drink in the middle of the city. You can't do this in my city, Kampala, or even in Uganda, anywhere. Because every water produced there is bad, is contaminated water. So all those are challenges where God wants us to go and do something. And this morning, as we think of mission, I'd like us to focus ourselves that there are so many areas, there are so many people, there are so many countries where they are being faced with different challenges. In Africa, I've told you a few of them. I was tell you about food. How much so many children in Uganda cannot get food. Just it is not there. And they come to school on an empty stomach because food is not there. And when you come to Tasmania or Australia, you see people serving a lot of food, so many varieties of food, and sometimes they leave it on the plate and they throw it in the dustbin. That's hard for me to think of. But in this text, we see another player, that is Pharaoh's daughter. She was walking, possibly it was very warm, it was very hot, and she wanted to bathe in the Nile. And then as she walked, she saw a basket floating on the riverbank. And I always say that's where God places Christians. He places us in positions to see baskets, to see people, to see families, to see young people suffering because of different circumstances. But do you see such circumstances? Are you humble enough to see people suffering? I always say it could be in Africa, it could be in Indonesia, it could be in the Philippines, but it also could be here. I can imagine there are so many young people in Melbourne or in towns like here suffering with drugs, with alcohol. But do you see them? This morning, God wants to open our eyes from our boundaries, from our comfort zones, to see people in different circumstances that need ministry, that need mission. And Pharaoh's daughter was in that position. She was a princess. She had all the comfort around her in the palace, but she saw this basket floating. And then the next step, she did not end at seeing the basket, but she took another step towards the basket. That's what God calls us again this morning. First of all, to see, but then to go. We need to go. We need to move. We cannot do mission seated in the pews here comfortably. We can't. We can only do mission if we are ready to go out, like Pharaoh's daughter. You may not be able to go, like Pharaoh's daughter didn't go, but she sent somebody. I'm sure some people will tell me, but for me now, my age cannot allow me to fly from here to Uganda or from here to elsewhere. But you can facilitate somebody to go. Or you can pray. You can do something. So I always marry this with God himself in the same book, Exodus, in chapter 3. When he saw the children of Israel suffering in Egypt, I like those words that I have heard the cry, I have seen them suffer, and I have come to deliver them. That's the same model that God wants us to take. He wants us to see the baskets, and he wants us to go. And then, after this all happened, this poor girl, the sister of Moses, asked, "May I call you somebody to nurse this baby?" And then she said, "Yeah, okay, you could do." And this girl went and brought the real mother. That was very clever. And I like those words that Pharaoh's daughter used when they brought Moses' mother. In chapter 2, verse 9, the second part, it says, "Take this baby, nurse him for me, and I will pay you." That is mission. Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. Do you see anywhere where God calls you? Do you see any place? Do you hear any call? Do you see any such baskets floating somewhere? Actually, the other part, when they brought the basket and they opened the basket, Moses was crying. Do you hear those cries of so many children in Africa crying because of AIDS?